Imagine you cast your rod and nothing comes back. You are living in a remote coastline of the Asia Pacific and your only source of food is fish. There are no fish. What do? Our next speaker is Dr. Quentin Hanich. He loves to talk about fish and food security. Quentin has worked previously for a number of non-government organizations, even for Greenpeace. But currently, he is looking at long-term solutions in our oceans. Sustainable food sources for the Asia Pacific, long-term policy changes. We welcome Quentin Hanich to the program.
Thank you, Katina. I can't fish. I'm really, really bad at fishing, which is probably a good thing to be if you're going to talk about food security and fisheries. I'm going to talk about this from a personal point of view. I've been working in this field for about 15 years. I've worked for government, I've worked for NGOs, and now I work for academia. A lot of my work is actually consulting for international organisations such as the Australian Aid Program or World Bank or NGOs or national governments. In all that time, I've sailed across the sub-Antarctic, I've sailed across the Pacific, I've worked in a number of different developing countries, I work in Canberra, and I've learnt one important insight. There's a really important thing that's the same everywhere. Marine conservation is not about the environment, it's about people. Environment's fine, you know, climate change, overfishing, whatever, the environment will still be there. It might be different, but that doesn't really matter. It's the impact on us, and it's the impact that we have on the environment that's actually the problem. Now, when I used to work in the Antarctic and the sub-Antarctic, that's a little bit separate. You know, you're in places where there's no people, penguins are the key population, it's the occasional ship, and it doesn't really feel so in your face. When I work in the Pacific, which is where I mostly work now, it's all about people. Food security is the key issue of the day, and it's all about developing economies, and it's about people developing livelihoods and guaranteeing their future. It's all about people. So the key area that I mostly work in at the moment is the Western and Central Pacific. Now, Australia is not a fishing country. We don't tend to take fishing very seriously. We're not like the Italians in Europe or the Spanish or most of the Asian countries. So we don't necessarily relate to this. We think of agriculture when we think of food security. But in many countries of the world, particularly Southeast Asia, coastal Africa and the Pacific, food security is about fish. That's your key protein source. So when we talk about the Western Central Pacific tuna fisheries, we're talking about an area and an industry that provides critical revenue for 7 of the 14 Pacific Island states. In Kiribati last year, it was 70% of their entire government revenue. We're talking about a region that provides 60% of tuna for global tuna markets. We're talking about something that provides critical food security, both for local artisanal communities and also for simple things like canned tuna. We're talking about an industry that's worth over $7 billion a year. It doesn't get much more integrated or high-tech in fishing than this. And importantly, we're talking about something that occurs mostly within the waters under national jurisdiction. And what that means is that the actual industry occurs within somewhere that is owned. It's like land in some respects. So it basically means that most of this activity occurs within the control of a bunch of small island developing states and a couple of other developing states, primarily Indonesia and the Philippines. But we're talking about thousands and thousands of fishing vessels from global fleets that mostly come from Japan, China, Taiwan, America, Spain, Korea, etc. These are the rich countries. These are fleets that come from developed, wealthy countries to fish in the waters of small, poor developing countries. Now you can imagine some of the power imbalances that that creates, particularly when you're talking about highly capitalised industries coming and fishing in regions where there really isn't much capital available. And how do you address that problem? And this is where the personal story comes in. So for the last 11 or 12 years, I've been working in this field. When I first started, I was working in the Australian government, and then I started working for different NGOs before I started coming into academia. I was there at the first meeting when we started finishing off the Western Central Pacific Fisheries Commission, which is like a big international institution. We all sit down, all of the countries that are involved, and we try to negotiate conservation and management measures to sustainably manage these fisheries. Now, when we were doing this, we had what we thought at the time was the world's best organisation for managing these fisheries. It had all of the great international principles for sustainable management. It was precautionary. It was science-based decisions. It was ecosystem-based management. It had the latest and greatest in satellite vessel monitoring systems. It had everything that you could possibly have in an international institution. It even guaranteed the rights of developing states to make sure that you didn't pass measures that inequitably hurt the developing states. Now, every year for the last 11 years, we've sat down and we've listened to the scientists, and I've even given papers at the scientific committees as well, and we've sat down and we've discussed these papers, and we've accepted that we're overfishing big-eyed tuna, that we're at the very limit for many of the other tuna species, that we're completely hammering sharks, that we have all of these conservation and management problems that we're creating. And we're doing that because we have too many boats. Now, we all recognise that these are key issues that we're having. But when we sit down and we read our treaty and it says you must adopt a decision and it must be based on science, and we sit there and we all agree that something must be done, and it's you guys over there who should do it. None of us will accept the decision. We all think that somebody else should do it. And that's where the whole thing falls down. What we're having is a tragedy of the commons. Now, if anybody's studied natural resources, you've probably heard of the term tragedy of the commons. And it's basically where there's no ownership over the resource. Everyone has a form of shared rights or shared ownership over that resource. So consequently, everyone thinks, well, look, if I increase my fishing or if I chuck a couple more cattle on that field, the impact will be shared by everyone and I'll get the benefit. And the problem, of course, is that that inevitably leads to what we call the tragedy, which is you overfish the stock. You over-harvest the resource. And that means that everyone then pays the costs. But unfortunately, of course, it's not always the same. So in the Pacific, we have thousands of the most high-tech vessels that you can possibly have catching tuna. They're not little fishing boats. They're not like some ad from John West. Some of these vessels are 500 feet long. They have refrigerations on board that can go down to minus 60 degrees. They can catch thousands of tons. They utilise satellites. They utilise everything. Helicopters, sonar buoys, the whole lot. This is a Taiwanese vessel that we filmed in 2004 fishing in the high seas between Nauru and Papua New Guinea. We collected a bunch of information on this fishery before we presented it to various scientific committees. The other issue that we have is that not everyone has the same interests. We have purse seiners that catch skipjack tuna and yellowfin tuna for canned fisheries. And we have longliners that go off and target fresh and frozen. Well, why is that a problem? Because the impacts of measures apply differently depending on the fleet, and the benefits of the measures apply differently as well. And that's where our political stalemate happens. This is the problem that we have. Sovereign nations jealously guard their sovereignty. Now, we all know inherently that what David Bolton is saying is true. But the problem is, it's true. You go to an international meeting and you sit down, and I represent countries. I've sat down and I've represented Palau and I've advised Kiribati and I've sat on Australian delegations. And when you sit there, you have your national breach, and your job is to protect the national interest of that country. And you're going to argue hard for that because that's what your mandate is to do. So you sit there and you all negotiate for your national interest. And you forget that the long-term national interest of your state is a sustainable fishery. But in the short term, we can't wear any cost. Somebody else has to wear it. And that becomes a problem when you don't have any framework for making a decision. That your only framework for making the decision is some sort of ambiguous, ambivalent language about, look, you've just got to base your decisions on science, you should probably be a bit precautionary, and you shouldn't hurt the poor developing states. So what then happens is that you sit down, you listen to the scientists yet again say the fishery is overfished and you've got to reduce effort or reduce fishing mortality. And the scientists say that the key problem will be too much purse seine fishing and too much longline fishing, and you'll all nod your heads and you'll say, right. And the US delegation will read out a statement saying, we all must catch effort, we must reduce our fishing, and we all think that the solution should be equitable, not necessarily equal, but it should be equitable. And we will think that it should all go on that fleet over there, which we don't have any of. And we shouldn't put anything on that fleet over there, which we have lots of. And this is always what happens. This is the problem. So what our research project is trying to do is to develop a new framework for addressing these problems. And these problems are exactly the same in climate change, it's exactly the same in transboundary water resources and in any kind of activity. And it's where you basically work out criteria for transparently assessing the various interests at stake. And in this, we've worked out some various frameworks for assessing the different interests of different fleets. We've presented this at different international meetings, and it's been interesting to see how this impacts on negotiations. But what we're basically now saying is, when you say that the only measure we should support is a measure that impacts on this fleet, funnily enough, it doesn't impact on your fleet. And when you say we should develop a measure that's equitable, funnily enough, it doesn't impact on yours. So we're trying to introduce this transparency, that there's a neutral analysis. And then what we're trying to do with our research is start identifying key mutual interests and key understanding of how we can distribute what we call the conservation burden. So, for example, what would happen if we stop all the countries catching tuna? Well, Los Angeles, there's cattle, there's pork, there's chicken, there's tuna, there's cod, a whole bunch of different things. Kiribati, where we have a lot of research projects, there's rice and there's fish. What happens if you take fish off? There's rice. So obviously the impact of that conservation measure is going to be pretty inequitable on Kiribati. At the moment, all of the fish are taken by developed countries. And the measure that they propose is that all the conservation burden should fall on developing countries. So we again try to work out different principles and frameworks that can apply these measures in an equitable way. We've got a research framework that we set up in 2012. We have partners from around the world. We're now developing these principles and criteria, basing that on legal precedents, and now we hope to start developing that and pursuing that around the world. Thank you very much.